Hello everyone and welcome to this video. In this video, we are going to talk about a term that you would have heard a lot when we talk about web development and JavaScript, and that's DOM. Now let's understand what does DOM stand for. It represents Document Object Model. I know that sounds complicated at first, but to simplify it for you, think of it as a standard for understanding how to get, change, add, or delete HTML elements. Now, a lot of you would be thinking, why do I even need to do that? And what's happening? So, let me start with a very simple analogy. But before we go there, just a quick heads up on what you can expect in this video. We'll start with understanding the basics of DOM. Then we'll go on into deeper concepts of how the DOM represents an HTML document in memory that enables us to interact with an HTML document. And we will be exploring a lot of different APIs that helps us create web content and applications the way we are used to interacting with web applications in reality. So let's take an example of a TV. Let's say you have a television which is on in front of you and you do not like the show that's currently playing, and you also want to say decrease the volume. What are you going to do? So you need a way for interacting with the television. Now, it's a very simple answer that a remote is something that lets you do that. So it's a bridge that helps you interact with your TV, right? You can do any sort of operations that you want to do. And so, if we look at here, that the television in itself, and it cannot do interact with your television in the way remote is basically helping you make your dynamic active as well as dynamic. And in the same way, JavaScript makes the HTML page active and dynamic via DOM. Now, just like how you cannot do much with your television without a remote, or in itself, a television cannot do much. JavaScript also doesn't do much more than just basic calculations, string manipulations, collating different things together. But you cannot do anything more than that. So, in order for you to make an HTML document more interactive and dynamic, the script also needs to understand or to be able to access the elements and contents of that document. And it also needs to know when the user is interacting with it. And you would be thinking, how does it do that? So it does that by communicating with the browser using the properties, the methods, and the events in the interface, which is called the Document Object Model, or DOM. Now let's take a very simple example where, let's say, you want to basically change the color of a button when it's clicked, or you want to show something when your mouse is hovering over text, or you want to change the way your image appears, or you want to display some text on top of your image. All of these are examples of what is possible with this dynamic and active interaction that DOM enables. So let's understand what exactly is DOM, right? The first thing is DOM is not a programming language, but it's rather a programming interface for web documents. Now, when we are talking about that it's a programming interface that provides a certain it's a certain way where you're able to access the elements or the components of a web page. So we have to also understand that it represents your page so that programs can change the document structure, the style, and even the content. So internally, the DOM is a tree-like representation of web page. We will be looking at how this tree structure looks like, and how does your web page get translated into this tree-like structure, and it gets loaded into the browser. Now, since we are talking about a tree-like structure, the DOM represents the documents as nodes and objects, so that it's easily accessible by the program. And honestly, without DOM, the JavaScript language wouldn't have any model or notion of web pages, HTML documents, even SVG documents and their component parts. So DOM, you can think of it as a web API that we're using to build websites. Remember that DOM is also not language dependent. It's actually language independent. A lot of you would be thinking, is DOM a part of JavaScript? Is it independent? We will be talking about it in greater detail in the end. All right, now that we understand what DOM is, we are clear about the fact that it's not a programming language. It's also not a part of the JavaScript language. Let's understand how we can access the DOM. So when you create a script, whether it's an inline script element or it's included in the web page, you can immediately start using the API for the document or the window objects or to manipulate the document itself. Now, there are multiple ways in which you can use DOM. You can use these interactive elements for doing a lot of things, right from accessing the values of the elements which are entered or even adding new elements on the fly. We will be looking at practical examples of all of these later in the video. Now, as I said, the DOM was designed to be an independent web API irrespective of the language that you're using, because the goal of DOM was to make a structural representation of the document available from a single consistent API. So let's look at an example that makes it much more clearer for you as to what exactly DOM helps us do. So if you look at this example, essentially what's happening is that the moment we load our window, we want to create a new element, which is a new heading, and we want to add a text to it, which is called big head. And in order for us to be able to push this heading into our DOM tree, we're using, let's just assume that these are certain functions which are available. We will be looking at greater details of all of these as we proceed ahead. There's something called as append child. So what we essentially want to do is that this is our document, this is the head of our tree. We want to push this new element into the tree as a child. Uh, so we are basically saying that take my document, take the body, and append this heading to that particular tree so that now it's available. Now, this is one example of what is possible with DOM. You would be thinking that what exactly happened? Like, how are these objects linked? So, as I said, the web page is represented using a series of these objects. Now, it's important for us to understand what these hierarchy looks like. So, the main object, which is at the root, is your document object, which in turn houses all of the other objects, which could be your headings, your paragraphs, your tables, could be your form under them. And then there's a specific way in which we can interact with all of them. Now, let's start with a very simple example where we have a web page. There's a title. Title is irrespective of what is seen. We have a header and we have a paragraph. Now, if we look at how this particular web page is represented, like how this web page translates to a DOM tree for us to be able to interact with it using a JavaScript, we start with the root, which is document. Then we have HTML. Now, if you go back and look, there's a head and there's a body. So we have a head and a body. Within the head, we have the title, which says my document. Other in the body, which is seen on the web page, we have a header and a paragraph. So this is a very simple tree that looks like. Now, essentially, let's say I want to access my heading one. I would say document dot body dot header. So when we had to append this element, we said document dot body dot append child. So dot is an operator that basically helps us access the different properties, the different methods that are available for us to access the element. So if I were to summarize what are the different things we can do, we can change the content of whatever is visible on our web page. We can access all of the properties of these HTML elements. We can also create, add, delete, update the existing elements or add new elements as well. Now, when a web browser is parsing an HTML document, we know that it builds a DOM tree and then uses it to display that particular document. So let's start looking at these different objects and understand from right from the basics till the manipulation of DOM elements to see how we can make different interaction elements on our HTML page. Let's start with the document object. Document is the topmost object in the DOM tree. It has properties and methods which you can use to get information about the document using a rule known as dot notation. We've already seen it that in order to be able to access all the elements, whether it's your body, whether it's your head, or its further elements like paragraphs or headings, you can access it using the dot notation. Now, this is another example of what a tree would look like for a table. We have the table. Under that, we have the table body. Then we have rows, and within each rows, we have the different columns that are available. Now, let's look at a practical example of how we can basically use document and all of its available different properties and methods to get information. Now, if you look at this particular code, we have created a form where we have two fields. One is the first name and one is the last name, and then we have a submit button. Now, essentially, what I want to do is I want to count the number of elements that are there within this particular form. And how I'm going to do that is I've created a script. I've created a function which I'm going to call on the click of a button. So I've defined a button here. And on click, I'm calling this function called my function. Now I am using the find element property, or I would say methods of the document object. Now I say that in this document, get me an element by the ID. Now if you go to your form, you have defined your form with the ID called login form. So I'm fetching this form with the ID and I'm looking at all of the elements of that form and then doing a dot length on it to be able to get all of the details of the element. Now, another thing that I also want to do is that I want to be able to get the details of the first name here. Now, first name again here has a particular, um, I would say, name associated with it, with which we can basically get all of these details. So, what I'm doing is that I mean, there are two or three ways of basically going about it. What essentially we're going to do is, I know that this is the zeroth element of this particular form, so I still get my form. I say that get me the element 0 and get me its value. And now what I want to do is I've also created another paragraph which currently doesn't have like any text associated with it. So I want to basically take all of the information that is present in variable x and y and then display it in my display space. So I'm going to say that get the element by ID, which is the display space, and then inner HTML is another, I would say, method that's available, which lets you change the text or change the content of a given element. So we have taken our paragraph element using its ID, and then we are saying that change its content to found. We have found these many elements in the form where the first name entered is actually Y, and that's exactly where our script enters. So let's just go and quickly look at this practical example on our web browser. All right, so let's first look at what our web page looks like, and then we will be trying out this script and see whether we are able to do what we want to do. For now, let me comment out this part, which we will be discussing later. Let me go ahead and open this particular page. Okay, so we have a first name and a last name already entered. Let me default placeholder text that I have. Let me enter my name. Now, essentially, we have three elements in our form, which is the first name, last name, and the submit button. Now, I'm going to go ahead and click the try it button. So it says found three elements in the form. The first name entered is Laisha. Now, if I go ahead and change this name to a random name and say try it, it should be able to pick all of these changes. That's how it has, like, our JavaScript is now able to interact with the elements of my HTML, which is essentially the fields of my particular form. I can also change this to display the last name. Let's quickly go ahead and do that. Now, instead of getting the first name, which is the 0th element, I actually want to go ahead and get my last name. So I say element 1, and I change this to last name. I save it. I refresh my page. I say Donald Duck. I say try it. Let's let it load. It says duck. Now let's quickly check if it's working as expected. We say, all right, perfect. It's working the way we want it to work. So that's how we are able to access the elements from the DOM tree that was created by the web page structure that we just saw. All right, coming back to where we had left off. Now we also need to okay. So coming back to where we left off, we were able to get details of the things that were existing in our web page. We were also able to add text to an existing element. Now let's understand, how do we create elements? We want to add, say, probably another heading or another paragraph. So in order to do that, we have the create element method. Now what we want to do is, we want to, it again is a part of the document object. What we specify is what kind of element we are creating. We will be discussing again all of these different elements that you can create in much more greater detail. This is just to familiarize you with the different things that are available within the document object. Now, once we create an element and we say P, that means we're creating a paragraph element, we need to specify what information we wanted to display. So we use inner text as the property, and we say that whatever text we want to write, and then again we need to repeat the same thing. We say this is a document, go to the body and append this paragraph as a child in that particular tree. So let's go ahead and look at this particular code. Let me comment out this particular part. Let me refresh my window. Okay. All right, now if I click on try it, it has now given me, this is a paragraph created by a DOM. Now these kind of things are very useful when you're looking at applications where you want to display certain error messages, whether you want to display certain notifications in specific cases only when a particular user action has happened. So in order for us to do that, we need to first locate the element. fetch the element, and then decide what action do we want to do. Do we want to display the element? Do we want to create a new element if a certain element has this value? Let's say, this particular last name. You're trying to look for a particular last name, and if you have found uh, certain characters in this last name, you want to just flag it out by displaying it. So you can just go ahead and do this by just picking up a paragraph and adding the text of your choice within that paragraph. Right, now that we've understood the basics of DOM and we've also got a taste of what are the different things that we can do with DOM, let's start understanding the more finer details. Let's first start with multiple ways of finding HTML elements, because whenever we want to do something, we first need to locate the element and then we decide what do we want to do with the located element. So far, we've seen that we can locate the elements by ID, right? We did see that. Now, there are multiple ways we can go about it. If you want to manipulate any HTML element, we can find it by ID. We can find it by its tag name, its class name, when you want to select multiple of them. By CSS selectors, this is an interesting one. And we can also find HTML elements using the object collections. So let's start with the first one, where we basically utilize the ID. So a very simple example of this one would be, let's say we have uh, multiple divs in paragraphs. And if we are looking to just find the first div, we can just get element by ID, and then we can either display its text, change its text, update its text. We can go around doing anything. But the method that we're going to utilize is the get element by ID. Now, the next thing that we would want to do is get an element by tag name. So in order to access one or more elements, we can utilize their tag name. Let's say if we are looking to get all the divs or all the paragraphs, we can just get all the elements by the tag name, as easy as it gets. Now, let's say we want to get the elements by class name. If you look here, we have paragraphs, multiple of them. Two of them have a class called intro. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to fetch the paragraphs using their class name. So we would essentially be getting these. Now, since we are getting more than two, then definitely it's a list that we're going to get. So what I'm trying to do here is that I'm going to pick up this existing paragraph. And in order to get a reference to this, I'm utilizing get element by ID to get a reference to this paragraph. And I'm adding some information to this. The information that I'm adding here is nothing but whatever text I'm able to receive from the 0th match. Now, both this and this line both are a match when I'm doing a class name intro. So I'm going to get both of them. So let me just go ahead and show you how it's going to look like. So let's go to get element by class name. Now, what we see here is that we have two lines. Both of them have the same class. And all I'm just trying to do is, within this paragraph, I'm just trying to get the same text as hello world. Let me just save it real quickly and open it in my browser. And if you see here, the first paragraph index with class intro is hello world. I'm able to get it correctly. I can also change it to basically get my first occurrence. So if I just quickly refresh it, it'll just change the text to this example demonstrates. But what happens if I change this to 2, right? So right now there is no entry with 2. So there is no reference to 2. So essentially there would be an error. Let us see it in the console as well. It says x of 2 is undefined because there is no second index that is present in our list at all. So we have to be mindful of this, and it's always good to iterate over it using either a loop or like decide the range over which we want to iterate dynamically. All right. Let's go back to where we left off. Okay. So we were trying to understand how we can utilize class name to like reference the elements of our HTML. But here things get interesting. When we are utilizing CSS selectors, now when you want to access one or more elements from the DOM that matches one or more CSS selectors, we utilize different CSS selectors. So if you look here, we're utilizing the same example. We have 2 divs, 2 paragraphs, sorry, 3 divs and 2 paragraphs. So what we're trying to do here is we can actually find all the elements that match a specified CSS selector. It could be paragraph, it could be ID based, class name based, type based. It can also be attribute based. It could also be value of attribute. You can also do a parent-child relationship. And in order to do that, we're going to utilize the query selector all method. Now there are 2 methods. There's query selector, there's query selector all. Query selector all is going to give us all the occurrences or whatever selector we have passed as an argument. Query selector is only going to give us the first one that it sees. In this example, what we were trying to do is that for all of the paragraphs that we have in our particular HTML, we're trying to set their display property to none. That means that we're trying to remove it from our from the HTML page. Now let's look at a more practical example of this one. So okay, so what we've also to be mindful of here is that whatever selector we have, in this case it's P, it's going to be applied to the entire document and not just a particular element on which I'm running this query selector on. Now there are ways in which you can limit the scope where you apply this, but it's beyond the scope of this video at least. And once we are passing this, what is paragraphs? Like what is this returned from the query selector all method? It's going to return a list. To be specific, it's a node list that contains one element object for each of the descendant node that matches at least one of the specified selectors. And essentially what I'm trying to do here is that for each of the paragraphs that I have, I'm iterating over each of them and setting their background color as red. This is just to instantiate how you can iterate over the selector of your choice and do a bunch of things of your choice. Like you can change its color, you can choose to remove a certain text, you could mark its display as none. You could choose to move a certain text or add more text to an existing paragraph depending upon your particular use case. So let's just go ahead and run this and look at the output. So what I expect to see is that all of the paragraphs that I had, all of them are marked in red. But let's say I do not want to do this for all of my paragraphs. I only want to do it for the paragraphs which are specifically intro. Let's say I have a blog and I've specified certain things as intro. I only want to mark the intros with a specific color. So I can just specify my selector as p.intro, and once I refresh it, I only have the paragraph marked with the intro class colored in red. Now let's take another example. Let's say I have a div called my div, and there are multiple paragraphs and headings that are present within that. Now I can, what I'll do is I'll basically get my div in the element. So this element is a reference to this particular div in line number 17. Now within that div, I basically want to get all of the, like I'm using dot example. Dot example is basically signifying the class that I want. So you can specify dot class and it will give me all of these elements. And now when I do a document dot get element by, like what I'm trying to essentially do here is that I want to display this list length somewhere. So let me just quickly add a paragraph where the ID is demo. All right, let's save it and let's look at it in action. So if you see here, I had a heading and two paragraphs. All of them had the same class, which was dot example. And here, if we see, it gives us 3 as the total length of all of the elements which have the class as dot example. Now here you would be thinking that what if I want like all of the paragraphs with a particular class and with particular CSS property? Can I combine all of these selectors together? You can. You can actually pass multiple selectors as well. One such example is, let's say I have, let's say it was element itself. Let me, you can basically pass speed or, uh, let me you can basically pass p dot intro and p dot subheading together and you can get both of the references and then you can iterate over it. Now you'd be thinking, how do I know which is the right CSS selector to pass and what happens if I pass an incorrect CSS selector? You would actually be running into a syntax error. Like it won't impact anything on your page, but like it won't render anything with a syntax error. So you can actually refer to this list that's present to understand what are the different CSS selectors you can use. This is the one I had basically shown you, dot class. It selects all the elements with class equals to intro. There's another thing which is important is that if you want to like select everything with ID, you can use the hashtag preceded by whatever ID you want. Now, these are certain which are interesting ones. Let's say we want to select elements on the basis of a hierarchy. Let's say all the paragraph elements within a div elements, or all the paragraph elements where the parent is a div element, or all the paragraph element that is placed immediately after the div elements. So a bunch of these things are possible. There's a lot of things that you can do. So let's look at some of the examples to understand it in a practical way. Let me go back here. All right. So what we're trying to do here is that we're trying to change the background color of every paragraph element where the parent is a div element. And we just saw that in order to do that, I need to specify div being the parent and p being the child. So what I've done is I've created two divs. Both of these divs are basically parents of the paragraphs that are present inside. This is the paragraph which is not present inside a div. So I am expecting these two paragraphs to be colored in green. So let's go ahead and run this. And it works exactly as we expected it. Let me just go back to the code. So we had two divs. Within each div, we have a heading and a paragraph. This paragraph is nothing but a child of this div. And when I did a query selected all, I was basically able to find out both of these paragraph references and I iterated over them. In order to iterate, you can just simply run a for loop or you can run a loop the way I had run it over here that you can use for each to iterate over element, or you can just simply use a loop and iterate by index, and you can choose to set the property of your choice, change the content, or do anything that you like. Right, so we've seen the query selector all method. Let's also understand the query selector method. Now, query selector all will give us a node list, which is obviously non-live. But what if we only want the first occurrence of a particular selector of our choice? So we can just use the query selector. And given that it's only going to give us the first occurrence, we can do away with the loop. We can simply say style or background color to be green. Let's save it. Let's quickly refresh it. And here we have it. So instead of both of them being highlighted, we only have the first element being highlighted correctly. And that's how a document like how that's how query selector all method works. Now what if is there another way for us to be able to access the objects or find objects? Yes, definitely. We have something called as finding HTML by object collections. Now there are different object collections that we work with. Let's look at a very simple example where we are trying to do a bunch of things around a form. So we have a very simple form with two input fields and a submit button. And what we are trying to do is we are trying to iteratively look at the elements present within this form and display the values of that particular within this paragraph with an ID equals to demo. So let's go to the code. All right. Okay, so if you look here, we have a form with ID form 1. We have two fields. What we did first is I said documents.forms. So forms is the collection. Now I have specified the ID of the forms that I'm looking for. If there were multiple forms and I had not passed this X would actually be containing a reference to all of the forms that are present within my document. Then I am running a loop over all of the elements that are present. I have created an empty string to store the response, to store all of the element values. So whatever first name, last name values will be there by default. The placeholder text is Donald Duck. So I'm just appending the values with a break. And then I am basically utilizing the get element by ID, and I'm specifying the ID of this particular paragraph, and I'm utilizing inner HTML to be able to add the text. We will be talking more about inner HTML and multiple other ways of changing, adding, deleting text using DOM elements as well. But for now, inner HTML is something that we will be using a lot during all of our examples. So let's look at what output do we get. But the expected output is that after this line, we should be able to see the elements of the form, whatever are present as inputs. Let me open it in the browser. All right, let me enter my name. And I mean, if you look here, there's one thing that I missed telling is that whatever we are going to get using our query selector all method or even using HTML object collections, all of these are non-live node lists. What it means is that even if I'm going to change it here, the entries that I have here is not going to change. In order for us to be able to get a live list, we have HTML collections. We will be talking about the difference between the two and what it means that something is live and the other is not live. But here, whatever values we had in the form, we were able to get these values. In order for you to basically make it live, what you can do is you can add a function which only runs whether when you're submitting the form, or a certain action can track and pick these values since it's a non-live list. All right, going back to where we left off, now you would be thinking, is forms the only object collection that we can use? Absolutely not. There are multiple different collections that we can use. We'll come back to the differences. You can have anchors. You can get anything and everything from the document's body. You can find the root element using document element. You can count the number of elements where embedding, like something has been embedded. It could be code, images, video, text, anything. Forms is something that we've already seen. And you can do this with pretty much anything. You can do this with scripts, your title, your images. So let's look at few examples to understand how you can go about some of these elements. Uh, yeah, and it's pretty straightforward, but it's good to know the usage so that you can uh, have more control over what you want to do in your code. So what we have here is that we have a heading, we have three anchors with different names. What I'm trying to do is I'm just simply trying to count the number of anchors that are present within my code. I can basically utilize document.anchors to get the collection, and I can call the length function to understand how many of them we have in total. We simply go ahead, refresh it, and the answer we expect is that the number of anchors are actually okay. Probably we didn't save it. Okay, the number of anchors are three. We can do similar things with body as well. So I have my body, within that I have a heading and I have a paragraph. And let's just try to append some information here. So I'm trying to get the reference of this using get element by ID. And I'm saying that change the text to whatever text is present in the body. So our output should basically be all, both whatever's present JavaScript and displaying document, it should be repeated. So let's go ahead and look at the output. So that's exactly what happened. So we just replicated the body of our existing HTML again. And now let's also understand what document element means. So document element basically returns the element that is the root or element of the document. So mostly, for example, for the HTML tag, it's going to be the HTML document. But for any non-HTML, like non-empty HTML document, document element is mostly going to be your HTML element, which is nothing but this. And for any non-empty XML element, document will always be whatever element is the root element of the document. So let's just try to look at the document element for this one, and then we can just print the data. So what you see here is an object HTML, which is HTML element. And now let's try to get its whatever information is present inside. So we basically receive the same information that was present within that HTML tag. And that's how simple it is to interact with object collections. And now let's go ahead and understand the difference between what a node list is versus what a collection is, right? Because these are certain important concepts. So we've seen a couple of different ways of finding elements using this interface. We've seen query selected all, we've seen get element by class name, tag name, ID, and bunch of other things. So node list is generally returned with query selected all. It returns a static node list, which is also non-live. Methods like get element by class name, get elements by tag name, they return a live HTML collection. Now we will talk about the difference between now non-live and live, but like on both of them, you can use the length attribute. You can fetch the length of whatever, whether it's a collection or a node list. But HTML collection is a collection of document elements, whereas node list is a collection of nodes. So you have element nodes, you can have attribute nodes, you can have text nodes, anything. Here you can access, like in a node list, you can only access the elements by their index. That's why you would have seen in all of my examples, we had used a for loop to iterate over the output that is returned by query selected all. Whereas when we're talking about HTML collection, you can access it by their name, ID, or index number. So you have uh, more control over how you want to iterate over it. Now let's look at the major difference which I was mentioning, which is the non-live and live thing. So in an HTML collection, since it's always a live collection, let's say if you have a list and you add another element to a list in the DOM, the list in the HTML collection is also going to change. Whereas in case of a node list, since it's static and non-live, even if you add a new element, it's not going to change unless you run it again with your changes being saved. And that's all I had and that's exactly what the difference between HTML collection and node list is. Now let's move forward to understanding more ways of interacting with our HTML elements, and this is about changing HTML elements. Now, one of the most common one that we've seen so far is element.innerHTML, where we are basically accessing either of the element of our choice, which in most cases have been the paragraph. Let me just quickly show you what I'm referring to. So we've been doing this get element by ID demo where we get a reference to the paragraph element and then we say inner HTML and update the text. So
This is to change the inner HTML of an element. Now, let's say we want to change the attribute value of an HTML element, so we can access it using element.attribute. Let's say we want to change some CSS property or some style property of a particular element, like we just changed the background color of a paragraph, so we had utilized element.style.property, and we can specify the new value of that particular style. And another thing is that instead of like specifying just the attribute, we can also decide which attribute we want to set. Like we want to change the attribute value of a particular element by specifying that attribute here as well. So we can also go about utilizing the set attribute method. So let's look at some of the examples and understand how we can go about it. The simplest one and the most common one that you will come across a lot in your practical applications is inner HTML. So these are all the operations that you're doing on an element. So first you need to find an element which we just saw. Once we found the element and we have a reference to the element, what we can do is basically say, take the inner HTML and update it with the new text. And that's how simple it is. The next one we have is changing the value of an attribute. So we have an example where we had an image which was a smiley GIF, and now what we want to do is we want the script to change that to a JPG extension. Now let's look at how this can be done. So this is what my page looks like currently, and I want this image to be changed. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the reference of this particular image by utilizing the get element by ID, and I'm going to say that change the source, which is the reference to that image, to landscape.jpg. And that's how simple it is. I get a reference to my element. Uh, in this case, I did using ID. Depending upon your use case, you can do it by class name or tag name. Now that we have seen a bunch of things related to changing the elements, accessing the attributes, updating values, let's also look at how we can add dynamic HTML content, specifically things like date, timestamps. We'll look at multiple ways of doing that. So let's start with understanding how we can add dynamic HTML content, specifically date. So what I'm trying to do here is that I have defined a paragraph and I want the current date to be visible here. So I'm going to fetch the reference. I found the element using get element by ID, the ID here being demo. I say take the inner HTML and update it with date, and I'm utilizing the date function to get my current date. Let me just open this page. And you see, this is the current date. It's 21st December 2023. Now let's say I don't want to do this and I want to directly write to the output stream. In order to do that, I can utilize document.write and I can specify what function I'm utilizing. So this writes directly to the HTML output stream. But we have to be mindful of the fact that the placement of the script here plays a role. Wherever you place the script is where your data is going to be displayed. So right now it's placed between two paragraphs. So I'm expecting it to be sandwiched between these two paragraphs. Now, if I change the placement of my script, the position of that is going to change. So it's always better to utilize uh, either of them depending upon what use case you are serving. But it's always good to remember that never use document.write after your document is loaded, because you'll end up overwriting your document. Now, there's also another function that we had discussed, which was set attribute. Let me go back to the slides. So set attribute is a method that allows you to set a value to an attribute. And if the attribute doesn't exist, it is created first. So let's look at some of the examples of this one, and then we'll come back to certain best practices. So let's take our first example. So we have a very simple HTML with two headings and a paragraph. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to change the class of my heading. That means that I've defined. So let's take our first example. So we have a very simple HTML with two headings and a paragraph. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to change the class of my heading. That means that I've defined a small CSS class over here, and I'm trying to associate this new class with my existing heading. So what I'll essentially do, the first thing is I need to find my element. So I do document.getElement by ID, and then I say set attribute class to the new demo class. And I have also added a button so that whenever I click the button, my function gets executed. So let's look at this one quickly. Now when I say add class, you can see that the color has changed because color was the only attribute that's getting updated in this entire exercise. Now, what if I want to change the type of my particular element as well? I want to go from Say I have an input field and I want to change it to a button, or I have a button and I no longer need it, I want to change it to an input field, or something else. I'm just thinking along, or I would say I'm just thinking aloud here. So what I'm doing is I have an input field, and on the click of a button, I'm trying to change that input field to a button field. So I am updating the type. So type is the attribute that I'm updating here, and I say button. So for all of these operations, the first thing we do is we find the element. We say document. We want to get this element by ID. Here, the ID is my input. We set the attribute, and that's how simple it is. So let's go ahead and look at it. Once I say change, now OK is changed to a button. And that's how simple it is to deal with set attribute. There are certain best practices that are associated with set attributes, so let's look at those. Now, when we talk about style classes, or rather attributes of style, we generally define multiple of them together, either at a class level, could be at a tag level, could be at an element level as well. So let's say I'm just trying to update the background color. I can either do it using set attribute, or I can just go to the attribute and update its value. Both of them are valid, but I would suggest to always use the second method, because if you are utilizing set attribute to update the style, you will end up overwriting your style with just what you've specified here, and you'll have to specify all of the things that you want to update, even for updating only one element of your style. So it's always good to just update a single attribute in your entire set of style class that you've defined, and that's always a better method. Now we have seen two things. We have understood how to find elements. We've also understood how to change elements, like dynamically and both statically. The next thing is, how do we add, remove, and delete elements? So if you remember, during the beginning of this video, we had discussed an example where we had added a new paragraph on the fly, and we had utilized the create element method that is present under the document object. Now that is used to create an element first. But even if your element is created, it needs to be part of your DOM tree. In order for an element to be associated with the tree, you need to append it to the tree, and for that we have the append child method. In case you want to remove an element, we have the remove child method. Now there can also be a use case where you want to switch the position of, or you want to like replace an HTML element with another one. So you can go ahead and do that using replace child. Now, since this is a tree-like structure with objects and nodes, you can actually do a lot of things that you can do in a tree. Document.write is something which we have already seen, where we were utilizing it to write directly into the HTML output stream instead of referencing an element and then updating it. So let's start looking at examples of how we can utilize them, what are the different things that are possible, and then we will discuss about the other objects that are present apart from document. We talked about creating elements, adding, removing, replacing, and a bunch of other things. So let's first start by understanding how we can create an element and add that particular element to the DOM tree so that's available. So what we have here is two headings. We have a paragraph, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to add a new paragraph to our existing div. So let's go ahead and first look at what our page looks like without adding this new element. So let me just comment it out, and let's first look at our web page without the new element, and then we will add the new element. So this is our div element, and we're interested in adding something within this div element. So what we have done is that we first got the reference to this particular div element. Let me just uncomment out the whole thing. So what we have done is that we first need to create an element. I've created a paragraph element. You can create anything of your choice. This could be a table, a form, a button, anything. I've assigned some value. Since it's a paragraph, I say para.innerHTML equals to the text. Now what I do is I say document.get element by ID this div, because I want to create and append a child to this particular div. So I say append child, and I specify the node that I want to add to my tree, and that's it. Let's just go ahead and refresh our page and see it in action. So I've now added a paragraph to my particular page. Now, what if I want to remove a particular element that I no longer need? So how do I do that? It's also pretty straightforward. Let's say I have a particular paragraph and I want to remove it. So I need to first basically fetch that particular element that I want to remove and just call the remove function on that element. I've added a button here so that it's more easier to understand how it's happening. So currently, if you see, I'll basically click remove and this paragraph is going to be removed. And that's how simple it is. But what if you want to remove a particular element that is present within a parent element, like maybe one of the paragraphs which is present inside a div and not the whole div. So let's also look at that example. So we have a div here which has two different paragraphs, and I'm only interested in removing one of them, which is line number 9. The first thing is I get a reference to my parent, which is div. So I say get element by ID div1. And then I also get a reference to my child, which I want to remove. So I say get element by ID p1. Now what I say is for my parent, remove the child, and I give the reference of the child that I want to remove. So let's just go ahead and comment this out for the moment and look at what my page currently looks like. I have two paragraph, and this is another paragraph. Now what I'll do is I'll essentially chuck out one of the paragraphs and it's gone. So you can basically find out the relationship between the elements, which div is the parent of a given paragraph that you want to remove, and you can remove children accordingly. We will be discussing about how to handle nodes and the entire navigation of DOM and HTML in greater detail. Now, we know how to create, we know how to add, we also know how to remove. Let's also understand how we can replace nodes. So replacing is pretty straightforward as well. In this case, I have a list with me with three elements, which is coffee, tea, and milk. And what I want to do is replace one of the elements of this particular list. Let's say I want to replace tea with, say, juice. So what I need to do is basically find out the element, where is it lying. Then I need to create an element that I want to add. And then I have to replace the existing element with the new one. So let's look at how we can do that. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to get a reference to my list. So this is the ID, and I'm saying that I want the first child. I mean, in the list, coffee is the 0th child, tea is the first, milk is the second. So I'm getting tea. I'm getting a reference for that particular element. Then I create a new text node because I want to add it. Remember that everything here that you see, it's not just plain text, but it is a text node. We will talk about this as well. Um, and now what I want to do is I want to replace the child. So we specify new node first, and we then specify what is the node that is getting replaced with this new node. So new node is what we've created. What we are replacing with is that whatever element that we have found, we take the child that we want to replace it with, and that's how simple it is. So let's go ahead and look at the output of this one. So what we have here is coffee, tea, and milk. I say replace, and tea is replaced with juice. And that's how simple it is to deal with. That's how you can manipulate the DOMs very easily. Now, what I also want to emphasize here is the concept of children and child nodes. So let's understand more around that. Because when you talk about DOM, it's a tree structure. So everything here is like there's a parent, there are child nodes, there are nodes at the same level. So let's understand the whole concept. So if you look here on the right side of the screen, you see there's a document which is the root. There's an HTML. There's a head and body. Head generally has title. Body will have bunch of different things. Can be divs, tables, paragraphs. Everything under them will have certain kind of text. So the entire document is a document node. Every HTML element that you see here is an element node. So these are all element. The root for us is HTML. The text that you see inside the HTML elements is actually text nodes. These are not just text. And every HTML attribute is an attribute node. This is now deprecated in HTML DOM, still exists in XML DOM, but it's not relevant for us. And all the comments that you have within your HTML documents are actually comment nodes. Now we will look at a particular example and see how that translates to all the things that we are talking about here. So let's take an example on our left. So if you look here, HTML is our root node. It's the parent node. Sorry, not the parent, but the root node, which doesn't have any parent. Then when we check head and body are the child nodes of HTML. And head and body both have children nodes. Title is a child node of head. H1 and P are child nodes of body. Both title has a text node called DOM tutorial. H1 also has a text node called DOM lesson. P has hello world. So if you look here, we have head. Head has a parent node going to HTML. And if you look at body and head, both have a common parent, which is HTML. So both of them are actually sibling. And if you look at element head and element body. So there is also a combination of previous sibling and next sibling. We will be talking about this in greater detail, but for now, understand the concept of siblings since both of them have the same parent. And both of these are actually child nodes to HTML, and that's why they are called siblings to each other. So before we start understanding how to even access these nodes, let us understand what are the different elements, or rather the methods that are available with us for us to access any element. So first is node.child nodes. We've already seen that. This is basically used to access the child nodes of a selected parent. We just access the child nodes of a list. Now, when we say first child, it accesses the first child of a selected parent. Last child will give us the last child of the selected parent. If we have a particular element and we want to find the parent node, so we can find the parent node of a selected child node. Next sibling is basically used to access the next consecutive element of a selected element. In our previous example, let me go back to that slide. I think this one. So here, body is nothing but the next sibling of head, and head is the previous sibling of body because we're talking about the consecutive order in which they occur. And when we talk about previous sibling, it accesses the previous element of a selected element in the order it is occurring. Now, another thing that I want to point out, it's actually a common error in DOM processing, is to expect the element node to contain text. Let's take a very simple example. We have title. Let's take a look here. So we have DOM tutorial. Now, generally, what we would try to do is just do an element and we'll just try to fetch the text. But no, it's actually a text node. That's why we actually need to fetch this using inner HTML. Like we take a reference to this particular node and try to fetch its inner HTML. If we don't want to do that, we can also basically ask to get the node value of this particular node because title is the parent for this text node. So what we do is I get the reference to my title by saying the ID as demo. Then I get the first child, which is nothing but this text node, and then I say just give me the node value. Another way I can go about it is that I can say in my title of all the child nodes, this is the first child node. Give me the node value of the child nodes at the 0th index. So there are multiple ways you can go about it. This is just one of, I'm giving you multiple options in which you can access nodes. So now let's go ahead and look at the different ways in which we can access these nodes, and then we'll come back to the types of nodes. All right, so let's look at child nodes first. Okay, so if you look at this particular example, I have two headings, I have a particular paragraph, and what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to understand what are my child nodes. I've created a node list which holds all my child nodes, and then what I'm doing is I'm basically appending all of the nodes that are occurring for my body in a particular order. So let's go ahead and look at it. Now, I know a lot of you would be expecting to only see like the text and a bunch of other things, but I've added certain things like comments, and I've also added different kinds of elements to show you how this is going to look like. So if you see here, the first thing we see here is text, then we see comment, we have text, then we have heading 1, then we have the text of heading 1, then we have heading 2, which is an element, then we have the text of heading 2, then we have a paragraph, the text of paragraph, then we have another paragraph and the text of that paragraph, then we had a script which was executing all of it. And that's how internally as well, all of these elements, nodes are evaluated. Now coming back to the different types of nodes that we were discussing. Now we have looked at all of the concepts of navigating through nodes, understanding what is an element node. Element nodes do not hold text, but rather they hold text nodes. So element node is anything which is an element of an HTML, could be your headers, could be your headings, could be paragraphs, divs, could be your forms, could be lists, could be anything. Attribute node is a type 2 node which is deprecated, so let's not go ahead and discuss that. Text node is what we've been seeing so far. Text which is enclosed in an element is going to be considered as a text node. Even the comments that we have are actually comment nodes. Document node is nothing but the HTML document itself, which is the root of the whole DOM tree. Document type node is the doc type HTML that is present at the beginning of every HTML document that we have seen. Now that we know the whole concept of nodes, let's look at a quick example to understand this from a practical level as well. So what we have here is an unordered list. So if you look here, div is our parent node in the context of the list. Um, Heading and UL, which is the unordered list, both of them are child nodes for div. They are also sibling nodes because they both have the same parent. Unordered list again has a bunch of other children. So let's try to look at all of the things we've seen so far at a practical level as well. So what I'm trying to do first is I use the query selector to get all of the elements which have the class as items. I'm using dot items, and then I'm trying to get the parent node for this particular element. The parent node for this we expect is to be div. I'm setting the style and the color within the style as red. So essentially everything, including the heading and this list, should be colored in red. So let's go ahead and see that. Okay, just a minute. So what we see here is that everything is turned into red. Let's also look at our console to see that if it has pointed out the parent correctly. And yes, indeed, it says that div is the actual parent. Now let's say that I also want to understand the child. So what I can say is that I want all of, let's say I want to see the first children of my current element. So this basically should give me these text nodes, which will be each of the list elements that is present. Let's go ahead and refresh and check our console. So it gives me the list item since I asked for the first element. Now let's talk about siblings because that's also another concept we discussed. Now let's say that I want to look at the previous element sibling in reference to the unordered, unordered list, right? So let's go ahead and see that. Now, once I refresh, it will be appearing in my console.log. So as I mentioned in the beginning, both heading and unordered list are the children of the div element. Essentially, since they have the same parent, they are actually sibling nodes. And for the unordered list, since it is in the order in which they appear, unordered list is the next sibling of header, and H2 is the previous sibling for unordered list. We have talked about quite a lot of things so far. We have covered a bunch of things that we can do with DOM, a bunch of ways in which we can manipulate our HTML pages, move our elements around, change the way they look, change which elements can stay, what cannot stay. Now let's also look at some of the things which we've already seen but we did not discuss in detail is events. Now HTML DOM allows JavaScript to react to HTML events. Things like right now my mouse is moving. I can left click, I can click, I can move my mouse, I can let my mouse stay, take my mouse away, hover over a particular place. Now, all these are different events. When I load a particular web page, that's also an event. When I go back from that page, that's also an event. Now, how there are multiple ways in which I can react to these events. If you look at this GIF on the right, when I'm clicking on these different colors, the image on the top is actually changing. Sometimes when I'm clicking on a button, the color of the button can also change, or certain text is hovering when I'm saying add to cart. Now, all of these are reactions to HTML events. Now, what exactly do we do in order to be able to react to this event? So what we do is we specify a JavaScript action to be executed when an event occurs. For example, when I'm clicking on an HTML element, I can change the way it looks. I can run a function that does a bunch of things with another element, or it changes the parent properties, changes the style a little bit. Now, in order to execute the code when a user clicks on an element, we basically add JavaScript code to an HTML event attribute, which is on click, could be on mouse over, could be on hover, on mouse down. We will be looking at all of the different options that are available, but here you can do a bunch of things. You can call a JavaScript function, you can change a property. I mean, the possibilities are endless. So let's get straight into it. And then we'll come back to onload and unload functions when we are clear with the basics. All right. So let's start with something really basic where what I want to do is that the moment I am clicking on the heading 2, I want to change this text to oops. So what I'm doing is that on click, I want to take this particular element, that's why I say this.inner HTML, I want to change the text and update it to oops. And I say that click on this text, which is another heading. So these two are not going to do, they're going to change, stay unchanged. I've added another heading and I want to change it to oops. So let's go ahead and run this. So the moment I click on this text, it's going to change to oops. So this was an on-click event. Now we have seen multiple of them in our previous examples where I had created on-click buttons, where I was clicking on a button and a certain type of DOM manipulation was happening. Now let's look at a little bit more involved example. Now here, instead of you having to do everything within the header tag, you can also create a function and you can call that function from your script. Now what this function does is the same thing. Instead of passing the ID here, since I want to do it on the same header tag, I can pass a reference using the this pointer. And essentially this will do the same thing. The way of implementation here is different. Now, let's look at something which we have been seeing a lot in our previous example is what happens when we click on buttons. So I have defined a paragraph and what I want to do is that I want to be able to choose when do I want to see this text and when do I not want to see this text. So I have created two buttons. One is hide text. So the goal is that I want this paragraph's visibility to be hidden when I say hide text, and I want the visibility to be visible when I say show text. In order for me to be able to do that, what I've done is I've first found my element using get element by ID, and then I am setting an attribute value referencing the element, sorry, referencing the attribute of that element and setting the value. So let's go ahead and try it out. So when I say hide text, I can no longer see it. When I say show text, it comes up back again. So this was an on-click event again. Now let's look at another on-click button event. Let's say that when I click on the button, I want to show something. This is very relevant if you're building an e-commerce kind of website where you want to show that the whatever you were trying to add to cart was actually added. So let's go ahead and see this one. Now, once I click on try it, it's going to display the date and time. This is also relevant in cases where you're building trade booking systems where you want to show the time at which the trade was done. You can also choose to add this information at another place. You can create another function that does this job for you instead of keeping it to be displayed on the screen itself. Now, think of cases where you enter CAPTCHA, or you enter coupon codes on websites, and by default, the coupon code comes in caps even though you're entering in lowercase. Now, how does this happen? So we have events like on input, where whenever you are entering something in a text field, the moment you enter it, it is basically going to do some sort of operation on it. In this case, what I've done is I have an input field and I have created an event that whenever I have an input that is received, change that to uppercase. Now, what uppercase does, uppercase is another function that I have created. Now, the goal of this is to take the value of that particular element, which is the first name, which is the ID, I want to convert it to uppercase. So I've utilized the to uppercase function that is available in JavaScript. And the first thing that I do is I get a reference to the element that I want to do this for. And then I've defined that particular function that I want to be triggered in my event. So let's go ahead and execute this one. So right now I'm typing in lowercase, I'm typing random characters and are all coming up in caps. Uh, this is very relevant in practical applications, as I said, when you're working with CAPTCHA. Another extension of this could be when you are working, let's say, if you do not want to change everything to uppercase just yet, so you can utilize the on mouse thing. So let me, so okay, so now we have seen on-click events, we have seen on-input events. Now let's see on-mouse over, on-mouse out events. So what I'm trying to do here is that I've created a div and I want to do a bunch of things when the mouse is over the div and when the mouse is not. Now, once the mouse is over it, I want to change the message to thank you. Or when the mouse is out, I just want to show a message that says mouse over me. and I'm not changing anything apart from the text. So let's go ahead and execute this one. So this is the div for which we have done this. When I say on mouse over, it says thank you. When it's not, it says mouse over me. And that's how simple it is to create hover events as well. Now let's look at another interesting event, which is on mouse down, hold click. So what I've done here is that when I'm holding the mouse down, like clicking on it, what I'm doing is that I'm changing the background color and asking the person to release the mouse. And once the mouse is up, that is once the mouse is not down, it is restoring it back to another color and saying thank you for releasing. So let's go ahead and look at this one as well. So it says click me, I click, it says release me, and it says thank you. So there were two events. We clicked it, which was on mouse down. And since we also wanted a follow-up event when the mouse has been released, we used the on mouse down and the on mouse up events. We could have also used non-click event, but we couldn't have been able to do two different sort of things. So that's why we utilized this one. Now let's go back to where we had left off, is the onload and on unload functions. Now, onload and on-unload events are basically triggered when you as a user are entering or leaving a page. So similar to when you come to a page from another window, come back again. So onload event is generally used when you want to check things like your browser type, browser version, and you want to load the proper version of a web page. They're also useful when you want to deal with cookies. So we won't be delving into much detail of the onload and unload functions because we have something more important to discuss, which is event listeners. Now we have talked about events, but what exactly are event listeners? Now, event listeners basically attach an event handler to a specified element of our choice without overwriting the existing event handlers, obviously. Now, right now, what we did is we manually added it. We can also do it programmatically through our JavaScript. You can choose to add as many event handlers as you want. They can even be of the same type or different type to a single element. You can add event listeners to any DOM object and not just HTML events. Like you can add it to the window as well, like the whole window which is rendering your web page. So the add event listener method makes it easier to control how the event reacts to bubbling. Bubbling is how a particular event that you have created is applied, right? Is it from the innermost element to the outermost element, or it is from the outermost element to the innermost element? So when you are using add event listener method, the JavaScript is separated from the HTML markup. That means that your code is much more readable. It allows you to add or remove event listeners even when you do not control the HTML markup. So that's the major advantage that come up. And you can easily remove it using remove event listener method. Now let's look at how event listeners work and what are the different arguments that we can pass. And then we'll come back for event bubbling and event capturing. We just mentioned here that while using add event listener method, we have a particular attribute which controls these things. So let's go ahead and look at a few examples. Okay, so let's start with the first thing, which is a single event listener. So here what I've done is that I have a button and I want to add an on-click event here. So I basically get a reference for my button. I say get element by ID. I pass the ID of my button. I add an event listener, which the first argument is basically the event, which here in this case is click. Then I have to pass the function. The function can be anything of your choice, whatever you want to do whenever that event occurs. And then there's a third argument, which controls how this event is actually applied, whether it's bubbling or bubbling means inside out, or the other way, it's from the outermost element to the innermost element. By default, bubbling is how the events are applied. So in this case, what my function is doing is that it's just applying, just giving me an alert saying hello world. Let's go ahead and see that. So when I click on try it, my window is going to give me an alert that says hello world. That's how simple it was. Coming back to, I mentioned that you can apply multiple events of the same type or of the different type. But before we go there, let's also look at window event because events are not just limited to your HTML elements, but it can be applied to all of the DOM elements that exist. So here what we are trying to do is that if you resize your screen or the window in which your web page is being rendered, we are displaying a random number on the screen. So we have like the window object. We have added an event listener. The event is resize, and we are executing a function where we are getting a reference to our paragraph where we are rendering this random number and just showing it. So you don't necessarily need to like specify the function in a separate window. You can also specify the function on the fly over code as well. So let me show you how it looks like. So let me resize the window so you can see that the random number is changing as I resize it. Let me bring it back to normal. Okay. Now let's look at multiple event listeners. Now first let's try to add multiple listeners of the same type. So this is the similar example that we see. We have a button. We had added an on-click button that had an alert function which said hello world. Now once that hello world alert has gone, I want to add another alert which says this function was also executed. So let me go ahead and run this one. And when I say try it, hello world, as expected, it also says this function was also executed. And this was a homogeneous event listener. What if I want to add more event listeners of different kind? So here I have a mouse over, I have a click and mouse out when it's not over the particular element that I've added this event for. So again here I have a button. So when my mouse is over that button, I'm executing the first function. What it does is that it says mouse over. When I'm clicking, it gives me clicked as a message. When I'm not over that particular button, it gives me the message mouse out. And all of this message is coming under this paragraph whose ID is demo. And I'm using the document.get element by ID method to get a reference. Then I'm using the inner HTML method to be able to change the value of that particular element. And that's all we did. So let's go ahead and execute this one. So when I hover, it says mouse over. I clicked, it says clicked. And when I move over, it says moused out. And that's all we wanted to do with event listeners. Now, let's say that I want to remove my event listener. I no longer need that event listener. So let's look at an example. This is a slightly longer one. So what I have here is a div. Now this div element has an event listener, which is a mouse move. Now, whenever my mouse is moving, it's basically giving a random number. Now, what I've done is that the moment I click on the button, this event listener is going to be removed. And in order to remove the event listener, I can specify the name of the event and also what was the function that was associated with that event, and it will remove that event listener for me. And again, in order for me to remove it, I need to reference the element on which that event listener was initially added. So let's go ahead and look at this one as well. So right now, if my mouse is moving at any place, there's a random number that is getting displaced within this particular div because this event listener is limited to this div. If I move my mouse here, there's no number change that's going to happen because the scope of the event listener is only this div. Now I say remove. Now when I move my mouse, that number is not going to change because the event listener is no longer active. And that was all about event listeners. Now let's discuss a concept that we had mentioned initially when we talked about how add event listeners actually work. Now there's a third argument to this function, which is use capture. Now, whenever you add an event listener, there are two ways of propagating it in the HTML doc. Either it's bubbling or it's capturing. And if you look at it, event propagation is a way of defining the element order, whether it's inside out or it's from the outermost element to the inside element. Now, let's say if you have a paragraph element inside a div element and the user clicks on the paragraph element, which element's click event should be handled first? By default, it will be the paragraph element followed by the elements. Like if there's a div and that div is inside another div, so it'll be paragraph followed by the div followed by the div. So that's what is bubbling. In capturing, the outermost element is handled first and then the inner. That means the div elements click will be handled first and then the paragraph. By default, use capture is false and bubbling is the default capturing or rather propagation mechanism that is there. So let's look at an example and understand how this works. So let me first show you the code. So what I've done here is that I've created div1 to demonstrate bubbling and I've created a div2 to demonstrate capturing. Now, in case of div1, what will happen is that I have added an event listener, which on click says you click the white element. On the paragraph, I've added that particular event listener. And on my div, I've added the listener which says you click the orange element. Similarly, on my div2, I have added the same thing. Now let's see what difference it creates when I'm using bubbling versus when I'm using capturing. Also, an important thing here to note would be when I'm demonstrating bubbling, I've passed it as false. Even if you don't pass it, it's just defaulting to false. And for me to demonstrate capturing, I have passed the use capture as true. So let's go ahead and look at this one as well. So this one is bubbling. So when I do click me, it should first give me the white one followed by the orange one. So I clicked it. You click the white element. Now you click the orange element. So it propagated to the div towards the end. Now when I click on capturing, it should give me the orange element first, and then it should give me the white element. Now these kind of things are important when we are talking about applications where there's a lot of movement of elements. Could be your e-commerce website. Depends on how you want user clicks to change the elements, the positions. When there are multiple images that are being rendered, product images. In those cases, the way these events get propagated is more important. Uh, and that's all we had to discuss in terms of DOM. To give you a quick summary of DOM, we understand that DOM is an interface that lets us interact with our HTML pages through JavaScript. So it's again language independent, and you can use this interface via any other language. Also, could be Python, could be anything of your choice. But without the presence of the structure that it provides, we wouldn't be able to do the things in terms of interaction, and we won't be able to make our HTML pages active and dynamic. So DOM does help us to do a lot of different things, and that's all we had for today's lesson.